My name is Per Ove Eikeland. I'm a senior researcher at the Fridtjof Nansen Institute in Oslo, Norway. And we are partnered with a HyValue center, engaged together with partners in Norway and abroad in hydrogen research. I say welcome to this webinar jointly organized by the Faculty of Law, University of Bergen, the Norwegian School of Economics and HH, and the Fridtjof Nansen Institute. We are partners in the HyValue Research Consortium. The topic of today is the role of public and private finance in facilitating a role for hydrogen in Europe's energy transition. The EU, its member states, and Norway have adopted ambitious policies to promote clean hydrogen as a necessary part of this transition. Secure and sufficient financing of hydrogen projects is crucial. The bulk of it to come from private industry, but with public finance set to play an important leveraging role. To inform us on this topic of today, we have invited three prominent speakers from the European Commission, Enova, and the private sector. Our first speaker will be Johanna Schiele, Policy Officer at the European Commission, who will give a presentation on developments in financing hydrogen projects at EU level. She works on designing and implementing EU-wide auctions for renewable hydrogen production at the EU Innovation Fund under the umbrella of the EU Hydrogen Bank. She has previously worked in the power sector and in research on auctions and clean tech funding, and holds a BA from Oxford University and an MPA from Harvard University. Welcome. The second speaker is Sigmund Størseth, Senior Market Advisor with responsibility for hydrogen projects in Enova, who will give an overview of Norwegian public funding programs and the role played by Enova specifically. He has previously worked in SINTEF and research on hydrogen and CCS technologies, and holds a Master of Science in Nanotechnology and a Master of Technology Management from NTNU and the Norwegian School of Economics. Finally, Esmeralda Colombo, Marie Sklodowska-Curie, postdoc at the European Institute on Economics and Environment, and Policy and Public Funding Manager for Renewable Energy and Green Hydrogen Investors at Smart Energy Italy. We'll give a presentation on experiences in matching private and public funding from a private sector perspective. If you have questions to the speakers, please write these down in the chat. Ignacio Herrera Anchustegui, Associate Professor, Faculty of Law, University of Bergen, will moderate the questions and answer session towards the end. However, as Sigmund Størseth from Enova must leave us before this session, questions raised specifically to him will be addressed right after his presentation. Remark that the webinar will be recorded and uploaded on the web pages of HyValue and the organizing institutions. So we now welcome our first speaker, Johanna Schiele from the European Commission. Please, Johanna, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, both for the very kind introduction and the invitation to present today. I will spend most of my 25 minutes to talk about the new EU-wide hydrogen auctions, because this is really a novel financing instrument, and I think it merits spending some time on that, but then also a very short overview of other EU financing instruments for hydrogen projects. So I think I'm going to share my screen myself. Let me do that. Can you see it?
Yes.
Super. Let's do it like this so you can see the full screen. So at first, I would like to give a short overview of the EU Innovation Fund. The Innovation Fund is one of the world's largest clean tech funding instruments, and it's a fund that's financed through the European emissions trading system. This is also why Norwegian projects are eligible, because Norway is part of the EU ETS. Same with Iceland and Liechtenstein beyond the EU member states. And the Innovation Fund has 40 billion euros to invest at an average carbon price of 75 euros, because we get our money from the ETS, we depend on the carbon price. between 2020 and 2030. And this fund was set up to really financially support the transition to net zero. And we have a couple of clear objectives. The first one is don't crowd out private capital. So we're not funding technologies that can be funded in the market. So for example, regular renewables deployment like PV or wind is nothing that we would fund under the Innovation Fund. On the other hand, we try to focus on highly innovative and not quite yet commercially ready technologies. So it's not R&D funding that we do. All of the technologies that we fund have to be ready to deploy at scale and to become commercially available in the next couple of years. But we are also not funding commercially mature technologies that can get a loan from a bank. So we try to really fit that space in between with the risk appetite of a venture fund, but the budget more of a pension fund, so we can fund really large projects. And the technologies that we cover in the Innovation Fund include mostly energy-intensive industries. So that's chemicals, steel, cement, refineries, you name it. Then innovative renewables. So for example, floating offshore is something that we might do, or new types of geothermal, but then also manufacturing of components. So manufacturing of solar cells, of electrolyzers, batteries, etc. Energy storage and heat storage deployment, carbon capture storage. And since the ETS directive was revised last year and includes now 2 new sectors, mobility and buildings, we also support innovative projects in those sectors. Now, the Innovation Fund is relatively new. The fund was created in 2020, and since then we've been massively ramping up our funding capacity. So we started with the first call worth 1.1 billion euros in 2020, and this year, or starting in 2023, but the application phase is still open, we have our largest ever call with 4 billion for regular grants and 800 million euros for the new renewable hydrogen auction, which I'm going to talk about most today. As you can see, already under the regular grants, which came before the auction, hydrogen was a very prominent technology in the Innovation Fund. We have so far already supported 20 hydrogen projects that are currently reaching FID or are under construction. But then we also cover all of the other sectors I mentioned before. Now, what is the European Hydrogen Bank? The Hydrogen Bank is not a bank. It's a very confusing term. It's a set of measures to support the market ramp up of hydrogen production, both within the EU, but also to incentivize imports of hydrogen from outside the EU into the EU. And this is a little bit split responsibilities thing. So me at DG Clima under the Innovation Fund, we do an auction for the domestic production of renewable hydrogen. This is projects that are in the EU, but there's also a second part of the European Hydrogen Bank that's looking at imports, and this is done by colleagues at DG Energy. The Hydrogen Bank was an idea of von der Leyen's cabinet in her 2022 State of the Union speech, and after that things went very quick. We had the Repower EU communication come out that's looking at displacing Russian gas. This was still in 2022 in light of the gas price crisis. Then we adopted a communication on the Hydrogen Bank in March 2023, and we designed and implemented this auction within a year, and it launched in November last year. So now, for the first time ever, there is an open EU-wide auction for renewable hydrogen production, and what exactly that means and how it works is what I'm going to explain to you now. So we have an auction of subsidies to support the production of renewable hydrogen. And when designing this auction, we had 4 main objectives in mind. The first one is we want to reduce the cost gap between renewable and fossil hydrogen in the EU. So over time, there's a clear objective to come down the cost curve and to see if this technology can become cheaper quickly. The second objective is to allow price discovery and market formation for renewable hydrogen, because as you will know, hydrogen is not a traded commodity yet. There is no market hydrogen price like there is a spot market price in the power sector or the TTF price for gas. So we want to contribute to price discovery, and this is also why we're going to publish all of the price points that will come out of this auction. The third objective is to de-risk European hydrogen projects, and with de-risking I mean we want to make it possible for a bank to come in and give a loan to a project against our subsidy commitment. So we want to make these projects bankable. The fourth objective is to reduce the administrative burden. And this sounds a bit dry, but I think it's actually really, really important. It is quite complicated to apply for funding. The European funding landscape is quite fragmented. And we try to work with smart, more financial incentives like the completion bond that I will explain more about later, to reduce the size of the application, to make it possible also for SMEs and smaller companies to apply for these grants, and not just for big companies that can hire a ton of consultants to fill in an application. Now, what are the core items of the auction design? This first pilot auction that's currently open will have a budget of 800 million euros, and the auctioned good is RFNBO hydrogen. So what we're auctioning is a fixed premium in euros per kilogram of renewable hydrogen produced, and that will be paid for 10 years of operation of the project. This importantly also means that there are no payments before entry into operation, and this links back to this bankability point that against our operational subsidy, a project has to be able to lend to cover the initial investment costs. And that means in your bid, you can price in both OPEX and CAPEX, but the construction risk or the risk of not getting to entry into operation, we leave entirely with the private sector, because we think that construction risk and project risk is what the private sector carries best, and we shouldn't be spending taxpayers' money on something going wrong during the construction phase. The bids will be ranked on price only, so the only award criterion is price, but we do have some pass-fail pre-qualification criteria, so anyone who's passing those will go into the ranking of the supply curve, and then we award the lowest bid. So the projects that need the least subsidy per kilogram of hydrogen produced, those will be awarded. The auction is pay as bid. We don't index to inflation, and we don't pay the marginal bid price to everyone, so there's no inframarginal rent in this auction. The support will be output-based, as I already said, so we only pay upon the production of verified and certified RFNBO hydrogen. RFNBO, for those not familiar with EU slang, stands for Renewable Fuels of Non-Biological Origin, and it's basically non-biological renewable hydrogen. And lastly, we're going to pay every 6 months. Usually, EU grants are paid only once a year, but we made some calculations on how much liquidity cost this would mean for smaller projects if they're only being paid once a year, and we decided that it's worth it to pay every 6 months. This doesn't come out of the blue, this auction design. We had a very intensive stakeholder consultation process over more than a year, and we received roughly 800 individual feedback points from banks, from equity providers, and most importantly from project developers. So we hope that this design is fairly robust, but it's also a pilot auction. So once the auction closes in February, we'll be analyzing the results, and we'll hopefully improve the auction design on points that were not as anticipated. Now there's a bit of an extra to this 800 million by the EU, and that's a 350 million contribution by Germany, who really liked the auction design and who decided that on top of the 800 million of European funding for the cheapest projects, no matter where they are in Europe, they are going to contribute 350 million for further German projects that will still have to be ranked on price, but only within that German window. And this is state aid, but because we have designed the auction in line with the SEAC rules, so with the state aid rules, it was very easy to get state aid clearance for that German contribution, and we hope that next year we'll have more countries contributing to auctions as a service. Now, if you follow the news, you may have heard that von der Leyen announced a future auction that will match to the 3 billion support for hydrogen that was promised overall. And we are quite careful to take a staged approach. So we don't want to spend money too quickly on something that we are not confident that it really works. So we will first evaluate the results of this first pilot round. We will do a proper lessons learned process. And then we'll consult again on draft terms and conditions. So yes, there will be a new auction round this year still, and we'll be consulting on the terms and conditions for the new round in spring 2024, so in 2 or 3 months. Now this gets a bit nitty-gritty, but in case there are any people interested in bidding or just people interested in what criteria a project needs to fulfill in order to bid. This gives you an overview. You have to come with an electrolyzer that's at least 5 megawatts of capacity. No project can win more than a third of the total auction budget, so a third of 800 million. There is a ceiling price. That means there's a maximum bid price above which you will be disqualified. That's at €4.50 per kilogram of hydrogen produced. And what's really important, you have to reach entry into operation within a maximum of 5 years. So why is this so important? We have an opportunity cost of reserving money for projects that need some time to construct. And if that time is too long, or projects are actually immature and they never manage to reach entry into operation, we have blocked a lot of public money that could have been spent on better projects. And this is why we came up with this thing called completion guarantee. It's quite common already in renewable energy auctions. It's basically a deposit, like you would put down a deposit when you rent a flat. And projects have to put down this guarantee. It's obviously not a cash deposit, it's a bank guarantee, so you don't pay 100% of the cost, of 4% of the subsidy volume. And if you don't manage to reach entry into operation within 5 years, so if you have overestimated your own project maturity, then we'll not only terminate your support contract, but we will also keep that deposit. And what that does is that it should really discourage speculative bidding. It should discourage projects from bidding that are not actually mature enough to manage to be operational within a maximum of 5 years. And it also means that we have to do way less due diligence on the project maturity, and that should reduce the amount of documentation and the amount of people that we have to hire to read that documentation, which adds to this less bureaucracy goal of the auction. Some points on this pass-fail criteria before we get to the price ranking. So this looks like a lot, but actually these are all really short documents. Basically what we want to see and what we disqualify projects for before the price ranking is projects must have thought about where they get their renewable electricity from. If they haven't, we will disqualify them. Projects must have thought about who will buy the hydrogen and have a price hedging strategy between their cost side, so the renewable electricity cost, and the revenue side, so the hydrogen offtake. All of these documents are just pre-contractual, so you don't have to have any signed contracts yet, but you have to have at least a memorandum of understanding or a letter of intent with your power provider, with your hydrogen offtaker, with the electrolyzer manufacturer that you're intending to buy from, and also with the authorities that will give you your environmental and your grid connection permit. And then lastly, a letter of intent from a bank that they will give you the completion guarantee. Now, one sentence on cumulation. This is an auction that's supposed to cover the whole cost gap between renewable hydrogen and your substitute price, so either gas price or grey hydrogen price, depending on who you sell to. And because we can close the entire cost gap, we want to avoid that projects accumulate other types of public support. Why is this important? This is important because in the auction, we have competition on price, and we want that this competition on price reflects actually the most advantageous project conditions, and not in which country is the most other public support available. So if we were to run this auction and would allow projects to get other public support, like from the member state, we would only see Dutch, Danish, German, and maybe Norwegian projects win because the public subsidy situation is very generous in these countries, whilst we wouldn't see any projects from countries that have no subsidies for electrolyzers. So this is why we really want to create a level playing field, and in general, we exclude accumulation with other public support. Quick timeline. The call for this auction closes on the 8th of February in 2 weeks. We have set ourselves a goal to evaluate the whole thing within 2 months. So hopefully public results will be out by April 2024. And then projects will sign the grant agreement or their contract by the end of the year latest, but it can also go much quicker. And the maximum time to entry into operation will be 2029, but we expect that many projects will want to reach the January 28 deadline of the RFNBO delegated acts. Before that deadline, you get more generous conditions of where your power comes from. So we hope that many projects will be quicker and will actually produce hydrogen much quicker. key links are in the presentation. I hope it will be shared after the presentation. And now just 2 or 3 minutes on what else there is out there besides the Innovation Fund auction. I'm saying this with a crying and with a laughing eye because it's great that there's more support out there, but on the other hand, we want to avoid a fragmented funding landscape, and really we should be bundling all of these funding opportunities in a single or maybe just 2 programs. But at the moment, this is not yet the case. So there are other EU funding opportunities for hydrogen. The first one is actually very different from what we do because it's for infrastructure and not for production. This is the Connecting Europe Facility, or CEF, and that supports infrastructure needs across the EU and also across countries. So that could, for example, be hydrogen pipelines. Then we have Horizon Europe, which has also slightly different focus because it focuses on R&I expenditures and not on commercial projects. We have the Clean Hydrogen Partnership that's also giving out dedicated R&I funding, but only for hydrogen, not also for other technologies like Horizon Europe. Then there's InvestEU, which is the European Investment Bank's loan program, through which you can also get loans for hydrogen projects, among other technologies. And lastly, there's the Modernization Fund, which is another fund funded from the European Emissions Trading System, but it's only targeted at the 10 lowest income member states of the EU and is supposed to help those member states to transition to climate neutrality. Now, we haven't seen any hydrogen projects there yet. It's mostly things like energy efficiency measures or district heating, etc. But we hope that as this technology becomes more mature, it might also be something for the Modernization Fund. And with that, I'm going to stop, and maybe we have some time for questions as well.
Thank you very much, Johanna, for an excellent and to the point presentation with the focus on the new auction system developed. I'm sure there is plenty of questions to ask, but I think we should wait for the question and answer session. So please, the audience, prepare for that and come back with questions to you. So we now welcome the next speaker, which is Sigmund Størseth from Enova. So please, the screen is yours, Sigmund.
Thank you for that. Let's see, I guess you see my presentation now.
Yes, we do.
Very good, thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction initially, and also thank you for inviting Enova to this webinar. As Per said, I worked almost 10 years in SINTEF in my early life, and also worked in several FME centers. So it's nice to be back to these arenas. I think I truly know their high value and especially the competence centers and the meeting points they are for gathering competence in different actors within the fields. So it's very nice to be here to present. I will talk about public finance for hydrogen in Norway, and especially Nova's role, what we're doing and what we're thinking. A little bit of strategy in there as well. But I would like to just mention initially that Enova is what we call the national contact point for the Innovation Fund, which Johanna just talked about, which means that we have a coordinating role for Norwegian actors who would like to apply for the Innovation Fund. They're under the hydrogen auctions. So if you have further questions or are more interested in detailed information, please contact us, and we have quite good overview and also some services for those who are interested in that, just so that everybody know. Otherwise than that, I won't talk more about that instrument today, since it's already very good covered. So there's plenty that could be said. I've put up a small agenda. I'll talk briefly about the kind of the public finance field, Norwegian actors in that field in Norway. Then I'll go a little bit into market insights, kind of status in the market as we see it now in Norway, and also with a focus on the barriers and the future development, which we think is necessary to get kicking, and then I'll end with more concretely on our support programs and our thinking about the design on that. So that'll be much less detailed than what Johanna just said, but more an introduction to how it's designed and what's their goals really. But firstly, I copy-pasted this page, because if you're not aware of it, this is a very nice page, which is called HyValue, which is HyValue Hydrogen, which is an overview over all the public support which is given to hydrogen projects in Norway over the last, it's coming close to 10 years. So the overview, the data is back to 2015. And as you see in the top left corner, these are support giving from Enova, Norwegian Research Council, Gassnova, and Innovation Norway. And as you see, it's been quite a lot of hydrogen support over the last years, coming up to a record at least up to now, 2 years ago actually now, 2022, with almost 2.5 billion Norwegian NOK. I guess most of you know that 1 euro is a little bit more than 10 NOK, so you can roughly divide by 10 the numbers which you see here to get this into euros. And related to the size of the Norwegian economy and the Norwegian hydrogen actors, this is when we do the statistics, we believe that up until now, with these support schemes that we have, Norway is truly on the height, which with all other European countries, when it comes to at least the amount which has been spent, and then obviously we can discuss the programs and whether the money has been spent wisely. I think generally I can say that a lot of this money is still kind of pending in the projects. They have been granted from the public institutions, but the project hasn't, many of the larger projects hasn't really taken their final investment decisions yet and hasn't started. Which is kind of a general issue I think we see now in innovation projects following the last couple of years with increasing difficulties in the general economic situation, I would say, with expensive times and inflation, etc. And yeah, I'll come a little bit back to that in the future in the following slides, related to what we see as the barriers and what we think we need to do to get these projects really going and really start implementing the large scale and full scale projects. So going to that, I would like to start with what I've called Enova's market insights. This is kind of a temperature on where the market is at and what we can expect from hydrogen production projects these years. There's a lot happening in hydrogen, and the public debate is it's very active, and there are very many strong voices, and it's also many people speaking different tongues depending on really what they want to achieve. We, Enova, as a funding agency in Norway, we are here really to support the projects for the end users, just to put that in. So Innovation Norway generally supports the technology developers, and Enova generally support the end users of new technology for developing climate technology and reducing emissions. We also generally have technology neutral standing, meaning that we would like to engage in all the technologies which are necessary to reaching the low emission society. What is important for us then is that those who are to take the decisions on which technologies to choose when they want to design their future and the technologies for their future, that the knowledge base that they do that on, take those decisions on, is as good as possible. And related to what one thinks is the future potential of hydrogen, there is many voices out there pointing in different directions. We in Enova had a round of grants for hydrogen production for green hydrogen, especially produced for fuels for the maritime sector, actually 2 years ago now. And based on all that data, which we got in from the applications at that time, which were quite mature applications for projects who wanted to build hydrogen production projects in Norway, we made a report analyzing the data to try to say what can we really expect that the cost level will be for the production of green hydrogen. And this is kind of in the same spirit that Johanna talked about from the Innovation Fund, that sharing these data is a really benefit for those who want to take decisions on the future to reduce their risk, to try to have the knowledge base as good as possible. What we found was that, which is cited here in the news article, which I have copied in, is that we saw that from the project that Bjørn supported, that the cost of producing 1 kilogram of hydrogen would probably be in the range of about 60 kroners per kilogram, which means about 5 to 6 euros. And what does that mean? Well, it means that it's still very much more expensive than fossils. And I think we all know that, or if you all knew that. But then the question is, how do you come from this point and down to a realistic level where hydrogen actually can compete with the fossils? Because obviously in the long run, you need these projects to be competitive without public support. It's not many years ago that many actors out there, also those producing hydrogen, I believe, said or argued that in a 2030 perspective, you would see prices in the range of 30 kroners, 25 to 30 kroners, half of this. We believe that even though these numbers are 2 years old now, but we believe that these are the relevant numbers you will see in a 2030 perspective, because the projects who will produce hydrogen in 2030, they need to start building maybe next year or 2 years from now, and they need to take their investment decisions next year based on cost data of today. Meaning that yes, there will be technology development, obviously taking down the cost. There will be scale effects, etc. But this cost base is probably what we will see in the 2030 perspective, meaning that the first users will actually feel these costs. But obviously this is before subsidies then. So how do you kind of address that to get hydrogen into a cost competitive solution now, both for the first projects, but also in the future? So yeah, and this here I just copied one of the base case from the report, saying that well, we believe that the cost will be in the range of 60 kroners per kilogram, sorry. And the main part of this is the electricity cost, which obviously also is a high uncertainty post now, increasingly uncertainty around that cost. And for you working with hydrogen every day, this kind of cost share is probably not new for you. But what I would also like to show you is a very interesting Boston Consulting Group study, which came this fall, saying that you see in the bar figure on the left-hand side that just 3 years ago, they said that the consensus view in reports was that in a 2030 perspective, green hydrogen would be available to less than 3 euros per kilogram. But now, when we analyze the actual projects which are emerging, which will be those who produce this hydrogen in 2030, the cost base is more in the range of 5 to 8 euros per kilogram, which is in the same range as what we saw when we analyzed our data. Meaning that in a quite short time, the actually expectations towards the real energy cost for hydrogen as an energy carrier and a climate technology has doubled, which obviously lifts the barriers very much for those who want to invest in this technology for reducing their emissions, and also for those who want to invest in the technology to sell that hydrogen to contribute to new technologies. So also, what do we think that hydrogen should cost with today's legislation if it should be competitive towards fuels. We have, just to state that in a Norwegian perspective, we have a main emphasis, Enova, and I would say Norway as a country also has a main emphasis on the maritime sector, where both hydrogen and ammonia as fuel, we do believe will have a significant role, and the industrial sector. Land-based transportation could have a role also, but at least in the starting phase, the volumes will be much smaller, since each user will obviously be smaller, and also since the actual availability of trucks so far and buses is still quite low, which is a bottleneck into that development as well. So we have a main emphasis on the maritime application of hydrogen and industrial application of hydrogen. So for those two sectors, with the current legislation, and for those who doesn't know that, in Norway we have a CO2 tax regime, which is politically very stable, I would say, increasing up to 2,000 Norwegian kroners per ton of CO2 until 2030, so a little less than 200 euros per ton. And with that legislation, which we now have, hydrogen should cost in the range of 40 up to maybe 50 kilograms, NOK per kilograms for the maritime fuel, and as low as 20 to 25 NOK per kilogram for the industrial applications, which has usually LNG or natural gas as their energy source today. So what is the reasoning for what I'm saying this is that the cost barriers are still quite large here, and when we design support programs, which I'm coming to, you always need to have in mind which barriers are you now addressing, which effect will they have, and which support programs are needed to follow them, such that in the end you do not need support programs anymore. So this can stand on their own feet, and doing those analysis and reducing the risk on the funding side, on the public funding side as well, to see where are we headed and what is needed on the legislation side, the regulation side, to actually have an exit of the public support in the end. Because if you don't know how to exit the support program, you don't have a sustainable way into the support and way out of the support. So knowing when you get in public support, you always need to know how do you get out, because otherwise you're stuck. And so when I'm putting up these numbers, is saying that, well, the current legislation we have in the without or outside of the ETS sector in Norway is up to 2,000 NOK per ton of CO2. We see that within a 2030 perspective, which I talked about in the previous slides, where we believe that a cost level of 60, 70 NOK per kilogram is probably what is realistic. That CO2 tax probably should be in the range of 3,000 to 4,000 NOK per ton of CO2 to make hydrogen competitive with fossil fuels. And as long as that's not the case on the legislation side, because we're aiming at 2,000 for now. Obviously, this will ramp up beyond 2030, but this is kind of where we are now. There's really still not a clear exit, which means that also when you add this with, I can now move to the next slide, that we're still at a very early stage for hydrogen projects. There are plenty of pilots, there are plenty of really good R&D projects going on, large-scale pilots and also industrial pilots emerging. But in actual full-scale application, we have one ferry in Norway, Hydra. Enova has supported about 10 hydrogen ships and 10 ammonia fuel ships by now, but none of these are on the waters, meaning that we are still at a very early stage. And because of that, since we see no clear exit on the cost side, which is still a large barrier also, and we haven't really started yet, our main focus is to get started. to get the first projects on the waters, to get the first industrial actors to realize their first large-scale industrial pilots, such that we can demonstrate technology. And based on that, when that's realized in a 2030 perspective, follow up with rollout support programs or regulation based on that technologies have been demonstrated, which reduces risks and also obviously reduces cost barriers because you take on cost by demonstrating the technologies. Especially both for industry and for maritime, I would like to point at the network barriers as well, because currently there's no supply chains, obviously, for hydrogen. We all quite often talk about the chicken and the egg problem, which is very prominent, and it's extra prominent, I would say, in the maritime sector because the users are smaller, and you need to bundle users to be able to take an investment decision on the production side, but you also should have more production sites along the coast to be able to actually operate the ships, which makes this network barrier very prominent. So to sum up kind of what we see as the goal in the maritime sector for now for our support programs, we do believe, firstly, that hydrogen and ammonia fuels will be necessary to take the sector to zero emission in a 2050 perspective. But we have barely started. I think obviously, or probably many of you know that we have earlier supported 5 what is usually referred to as hydrogen hubs for hydrogen production for the maritime sector. These either haven't taken their investment decision, and our conclusion is that, well, the cost base moved too quickly, the barriers were too high, and the support schemes at the time weren't strong enough. So now we've announced that we will have new support programs for hydrogen production towards the maritime sector as well, where we are able to support more of the capex. And this is a capex support scheme and not an OPEX support scheme as the Innovation Fund has provided. But with the goal of establishing the first functioning value chains for hydrogen and ammonia as fuel in Norway, meaning that you have more or less at the same time these points where you can fuel hydrogen and supporting the users, which then get their ships onto the waters. New now is that we say that, well, we think that both hydrogen and ammonia is necessary, and we need to support both of those infrastructures to be able to realize the new technologies. On the industrial side, we say that it's when we take temperature of the market, we see that the industrial projects are a little bit less mature. You have a handful which can use hydrogen as input factors or reducing agents. Otherwise than that, it's mainly for high temperature heat, where you use natural gas and LNG today. Cost barrier even higher than maritime. Projects also less mature. So main emphasis is on realizing these first large-scale industrial pilots for getting started. So I mentioned, I'm now moving on a little bit. So this is kind of the picture that we see. We are in there's still a really large cost barrier. There are networks barriers, and we are at a really starting point with few projects implemented. And what is the goal now is to get started to build a fundament such that in a 2030 perspective, you can follow up with rollout support programs, legislation or regulation to continue the development. So kind of our package for now is 2 support schemes for ships on the maritime side, hydrogen ships and ammonia in ships, which is competitive bidding, meaning that you bid on less support for realizing these zero emission ships, with the possibility to support up to 80% of the additional capex of realizing the zero emission ship. Additionally, we have announced, but details aren't out yet, but will be in the course of the first quarter of this year, a new round of what we call hydrogen hubs for maritime maritime projects, but also infrastructure for ammonia, which will be following this fall, for also addressing the network barriers for ammonia as fuel. Otherwise, just to kind of complete the picture, I can just kind of mention other support programs which we have at Enova related to hydrogen or relevant to hydrogen, such that you can see the whole picture. We have one support program for hydrogen trucks and filling stations. We have a general program for new technology within the industry called Industry 2050, and what I emphasized as large-scale pilots for hydrogen as heat or other applications of hydrogen as well within the industry sector generally can have good support mechanisms to this program. Yeah, this is a little bit duplicating what I talked about hydrogen ships and ammonia ships, but it's for really innovative technologies. It could be all technologies within the maritime sector, but also relevant for hydrogen and ammonia, new types of fuel cells, etc. And lastly, also support program called Technology for Sustainable Energy Carriers, which has emphasis of piloting of new technologies in the value chains up before the end use. So it could be production technology, storage technology, commissioning, liquefaction, bunkering, etc. But all of these four, except the first one, hydrogen trucks, has a main emphasis on technology development and piloting, industrial piloting. So as you see, I think I've spent my time. There's a lot going on. There has been spent a lot of public money in Norway into hydrogen, but we are still in a really early phase, and the most important now, as we see it, is to get the first project actually implemented, such that we can reduce the technology risk and the cost risks and learn from those, such that we can build on that for future development within the value chains and technologies. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sigmund, for an excellent presentation, and also thought-provoking on a number of policy measures that may be needed to kind of go together to promote the commercialization of new technology. So as you must leave now, or before the question and answer session, I leave the floor to Ignacio and ask if you have recorded any questions for Sigmund in the chat.
Yes. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. We have almost 50 people here in this webinar tuning in to find out financing of hydrogen at European and at your Norwegian level. My name is Ignacio Herrera Anchustegui. Peruve introduced me before, and I'm just going to be moderating a little bit on the Q&A, but also Johanna has to leave for another meeting as well. So what I would suggest is that we will take together questions for Sigmund and Johanna, then we will have Esmeralda, and then Esmeralda will answer her questions. So the first thing is I would like to say thank you both for excellent presentations in a different level of what it's being discussed at a hydrogen financing. So Johanna is speaking from a European Union perspective, where European funds are being channeled to projects, mostly, as far as I understand, related to infrastructure and production as well, to some way. And whereas Sigmund is speaking of the national aspects on this. So in a way, they complement each other. So I have a question for both of you. My question will be the following. Is in a way the financing through EU funds or EEA funds having an effect that could stifle funding at a national level? What I mean is the following. So maybe could countries be expecting that the European level is going to do the big heavy lifting, and then the national institutions will say, we will wait about it? Or perhaps, and I guess this is what is being discussed, this is a game that there's not enough money for all that needs to be done, so everybody needs to put a big share on this. But I just wanted to hear from you a bit generally on this interplay EU EA level and a national level, and whether there are some overlapping or contradictions between what is being financed. And then we do have 2 questions from the audience. Johanna just answered to Terje one of them, but we have also from Knut, and I'll leave the word to you guys to discuss this, and I have a couple other things as well. Yes, Johanna, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure, happy to. This is a difficult question, right? Because in an ideal world, we wouldn't have 2 different funding instruments to fund the same thing twice. And what do I mean with ideal world? I mean, there's enough money available. And why do I say that? I say that because it's quite complicated for companies to understand all of the different funding schemes, and they have to invest a lot of resources into public affairs people and regulatory affairs people to understand what's available on level and what documents they need to prepare to apply. So that's not ideal. That caveated, I think within the hydrogen value chain, there are a lot of different things that need funding. There's R&I for less mature technologies. For example, SOEC is a technology that definitely still needs research. Same with very flexible operation of electrolyzers. How can we improve flexibility to manage intermittency of renewables? I think there's a lot of research. Water purity, using salt water for electrolysis. I can think of a handful of research topics that still need funding. Then there's the electrolyzer manufacturing, infrastructure, so pipelines, hydrogen pipelines, and then the production of renewable hydrogen. And I think it's fair that for genuinely different things, you have different programs, because the project scopes are not overlapping. The need for money is very different. So for example, manufacturing is CapEx only, whereas production, 70% of the costs are OpEx. Of course, you would have a different funding design for these. So I think that's fair that there's different programs for that. Then the second caveat I made is on the budget that's available. So in the Innovation Fund, we have 800 million for projects all over Europe in this first pilot auction. This is nowhere near enough to plug the funding gap that we have, and also nowhere near enough to reach the deployment targets that many countries have, including Norway. So there, I mean, I don't want to go as far as saying the more the better, but I think there's definitely room for different funding schemes without getting in the way of each other and taking projects away from each other. That said, for hydrogen production, why we offer auctions as a service is because we think that it's really valuable to have one set of rules and one auction design so that all the price points that come out of it are comparable. And we know that there's not political appetite for a proper European solution, so just more money on the European level. There's no political appetite for that from member states, because that would mean that maybe German money is funding a Spanish projects. Governments genuinely don't want that generally. So the second best compromise that we found was to say, at least we have the same auction rules, and we do the administrative effort for the member state. So we design the auction, we run the auction, we do the pre-qualification, we write the state aid notification for you. So if you want to participate in auctions as a service, you can contribute Norwegian money just for Norwegian projects, but you commit to using the same auction design and to respecting the price ranking that we create. So that's sort of a halfway house we're trying with this compromise. We're pretty excited that Germany has jumped on that train already in this pilot auction without knowing at all what's going to come out of it. And we hope that we can, well, sell this as a sexy solution next year also to other member states. And we hope that this is also going to make things easier for companies like Statkraft or Ørsted or RWE that are active in many, many member states. And we don't need 27 different funding schemes for hydrogen production, plus a European one. It's a waste of administrative time and effort, and also companies' time to try and understand that.
Excellent, Johanna. I'll give the word now to Sigmund, and then we take some questions from the audience. Yes.
Yeah. I think I'll second everything Johanna said, I think, to start with. obviously we've seen that that a few of the very large scale projects in Norway, they has a very good fit. They have a very good fit with the general innovation fund. And Norway has a very good luck, or been very good, either or both. In the innovation fund, we had 5 projects awarded this year, which is great. So at least what is extremely important, and we have we are very much aware of that and working closely, hardly with that these days, I would say, is that the support programs which are available on the European level should be closely coordinated than what we do on the national level. So we know them well. We know the details. We even talk with Johanna and our colleagues every now and then if necessary, and we make sure that when we do something nationally with potentially could overlap, we at our part make sure that they're coordinated in a way which makes sense for the national ambitions, right? So, for example, now we have decided to have a national scheme for hydrogen production, which in what you support, what type of project you can support, is a little bit of overlapping with the auctions. We considered the auctions a service. For once, we didn't have enough time to make the decisions aligned with national budgets, etc. this year. But generally, we very much like that way of doing things and the service that you provide from the EU side, and that could be very good solutions on later stage. At this stage, we saw that we have very specific national ambitions, especially related to the maritime industry, where we would like to have criteria, especially for making sure that we were able to address that, which we didn't think that we wouldn't get good enough targets on if we just went through the auctions. So that could be reasons to having different schemes on national level and the EU level. Also because the ambitions or goals isn't necessarily overlapping. Not that they're dragging in different directions, but they're not necessarily overlapping on national level and the EU level, because you could have more specific goals for specific sectors, etc. on a national level. But to conclude, we see it as very important and a part of our job to see that the national support schemes takes into account what's happening on the EU level, such that it's aligned as much as it could be.
Excellent, Sigmund. Thank you very much for that clarification as well on this. I want to go now to a question that came out from the chat from Knut. And the question from Knut is about the comparison to hydrogen in regards to cost and kilogram and other fossil fuels, because of the possibility that, well, hydrogen contains more energy. But before I go into that, you both spoke also about a key element here, which is the ETS system. So both, Johanna, you mentioned ETS as the engine that is helping you to fund all these different projects. So whenever you have allowances and companies have to pay for that, this is where the money comes from to foster technology that is going to help in climate change, tackling it, mitigating or abating it. And then Sigmund, you said, well, we have a lot of ambitions in Norway. We have the ETS system. The ETS system applies in Norway, and in addition to that, we have a CO2 tax for certain industries in Norway. I'm familiar with, for example, the one that applies to oil and gas. You were mentioning about maritime transport, but I think your point, Sigmund, was it's not enough. We need to make a legislative change in Norway, aggressive legislative change, in order to be able to raise cost of carbon so that green hydrogen becomes actually competitive, right? And this is a discussion on a political level as well on what do we want to do as a society and how much are we preparing to pay for mitigation of climate change and climate risks. But I want to see whether, Sigmund, you have any comments on Knut's point, and if you could expand a little bit on what would be your takeaway message for politicians out there on what should we do when we are talking about CO2 tax in Norway so that hydrogen can take off.
Well, I think obviously, and it's not dangerous to just state that CO2 tax is the engine of in the end getting the transition to clean tech and giving to the low emission society. our role now, both what we're doing and then what Johanna and her colleagues are doing, is supporting the first programs, the projects, to demonstrate these technologies, to start the value chains and reduce the barriers as much as you can. But in the end, you cannot subsidize the future in the end, at the long run, right? And then it just needs to cost more to emit. So what we're very keen on, or we try to say clearly now, is that with those sectors which are not into the ETS now, we are aiming toward 2,000 NOx per ton. In Norway, the ETS runs for itself, and it's really going up these days, which is good. But we say that though for hydrogen, now we're building the fundament through pilots and through value chains for maritime. But what we see now is not enough for making this running beyond the 2030s perspective from what is the current legislation. So after what we're now doing, we would neither have to regulate, you need to have higher legislation or higher CO2 taxes, or you will need to have continued support. So because we see tendencies in the debate from some of the actors in the hydrogen scene in Norway to say that, for example, there's been a lot of discussion on contracts for difference, CFDs, saying that, well, this is now just until 2030 and then it will run by itself. We don't think that's true because the cost base is higher than that, which means that those who want to invest in the future, the actors out there, the market actors, they should have that information before they invest. But also the politicians should know that, well, it won't run by itself by 2030. You need to do more, or you need to put more money on the table, or yeah. So kind of trying to put information out there such that those who make decisions, both on the political side and the market actor side, can do that with a good knowledge base as possible. Yeah.
Good. I'm going to press you a little bit to answer the question that Knut has about the comparison on hydrogen on petrol diesel. Do you agree with this comment with Knut, or should I let you guys discuss about it on the chat? And Johanna, if you want to say something about it, please jump in. And then if we have any further questions in the chat, give it to us. If not, let's move on also after this to Esmeralda's presentation, so that we have enough time for Esmeralda's presentation and questions. But Sigmund, Johanna, and then we move on.
Maybe Johanna wanted to comment on the ETS and CO2 taxes before I take the specific question on the... Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah, so the comparison on the kilograms per NOx per kilograms. I saw a question in the chat, and I probably haven't made myself clear enough. So what we've done is to look at what we call the fossil parity, meaning that, okay, so what does it cost to produce hydrogen? We think it's about 60 NOx per kilogram, and 1 kilogram of hydrogen has about 33 kilowatt hours in it. It's a little bit less than 2 NOx per kilowatt hour. And then we calculate around saying that, okay, so at a fossil price as we see in the market today, if you calculate that around to what would hydrogen need to cost to match that price, and then we also take into account that you have energy efficiency differences on fuel cells towards combustion engines, etc. So the comparison was on what would the hydrogen price, what should the hydrogen price be taken into account, the energy content and also the efficiencies of the different technologies, making the gap there. So definitely you need to compare apples to apples. So I probably wasn't clear. I tend to take that part a little bit fast.
No, I think you have clarified in an excellent way, Sigmund here, and Knut also agrees. Johanna, you wanted to say something? And I have one last question before I let you go.
Okay, no, not much to add, just that, yes, I mean, it's just one way to show you have to pay based on something, and hydrogen is usually measured in kilograms or in joule. So obviously you can make the calculation, 1 kilogram, 33.3 kilowatt hours. You can transfer it to anything you want. But I get that on a second level, there's a communications point. What can people relate to? And indeed, no one can relate to a kilogram of hydrogen because most people don't know how does that compare to a measurement that I'm familiar with. So in our communications, we try to make the point that we also say, what does this mean in terms of euros per ton of carbon abated? What does this mean in terms of euros per energy content? But that's more of a comms point than fundamental economics doesn't change anything.
But I think it's a very good point, because even the fundamental economics are not going to change because of this. The perception and the understanding of society is what really matters in the end, because we need this to be solved. Johanna, before I let you go, because I know Sigmund has to go and pick up a family member in the kindergarten, and Johanna has to go to a meeting. Johanna, just a very quick question. Are we going to see at some point hydrogen auctions in Prisma, in the auction system for joint purchasing of energy that is working already on gas? I don't know if you're familiar with this. Yes?
Yes, I didn't catch the beginning of the question. Will we plan to run it through Prisma, or what's?
Yes, because as far as I understand, Prisma was designed and is designed to purchase gas, joint purchasing of gas, but it was at some point also discussed to be a starting point to generate also demand for hydrogen. I've worked a little bit on public procurement, so that's why I'm asking this question, but I'm wondering if we will see also utilization of Prisma for hydrogen, or that's something that is not being discussed on the table at the moment.
So that's actually very topical, because today the gas package was passed and there is some language about an aggregation mechanism also for hydrogen in that gas package. I would say these are two very different things. Prisma is to actually procure something where you become the legal owner of the good. We only do payments management. We auction off a subsidy. We're not H2 Global. We're not being the intermediary that actually owns the hydrogen net. We never own the hydrogen at any point in time. What I think this demand aggregation mechanism can be useful for is to have a very good database of who are the off-takers, where are they, where does infrastructure have to be built, and then maybe connecting producers and consumers so they can create off-take contracts between themselves. But I reckon a grants payment program will always run through the European grants management system, which has nothing to do with Prisma. So that would be how I would see it. One is matchmaking, demand aggregation. The other one is, are we buying or are we paying for subsidy, but someone else is buying for the hydrogen?
Yes, very good. Thank you so much for those clarifications. And also thank you for addressing the questions from the audience. So what we'll do, I'll give the word again to Per-Ove, and we will continue with the seminar, and then I'll be back again with questions for Esmeralda that is next online.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Ignacio, for your leadership in questions and answers, and for you too, that you took time to thoroughly go through questions and give extra information and good answers to the questions. So our final speaker for this webinar is Esmeralda Colombo. So please, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Per-Ove and Ignacio, for the invitation. It was really a great conversation so far with an impressive lineup of experts. So what I can add is the private sector perspective and some use cases. So on the ground, how are hydrogen projects financed? I work as a policy and public funding manager for Smart Energy. We do investments in solar, wind, and green hydrogen. We started with green hydrogen early on when the market was still embryonic in 2019. So we are some of the first movers in Europe, and this is why I would like to proceed from the more general picture on the pipeline of projects so far. We have a pipeline of built 7 gigawatts in Europe and 12 gigawatts that are in the pipeline still in Europe. This is our reference market. But I will also look into the use case of Italy, because Italy decided not to follow the auctions as a service way that Johanna explained so well before. So there are new tariffs that are now under public comment. They were published just last week, and this is a great occasion to present to you the national approach to public funding for hydrogen. So starting from the general picture, as you know, the pipeline of H2 projects is impressive. Announced projects in Europe only stack up to 54 gigawatts by 2030. It was recently reduced actually from over 80 gigawatts, but the increase is not going to stop. Still, and this was a problem mentioned earlier, only around 1 gigawatt of electrolyzer capacity will be operational by 2030. So it's well below the scale needed to produce the 10 million ton domestic production targets at the EU level by 2030. So the problem is that only a part of announced projects reach FID, so final investment decision. Only about 10% have achieved FID, and the EU is not in the lead. So why is it that traditional finance rules have grown out of the fossil economy? They are not apt to the hydrogen economy. Let's just put it very plain. So the big question is, can hydrogen and its derivatives substantially decrease and replace oil and gas flows, as Sigmund was considering? And this is a big question for Norway as a petrostate, but also for Italy, a heavily gas-reliant economy. So as a start, we need to acknowledge that traditional finance rules do not apply as we know them, and that this is a bankability problem. Green hydrogen projects are generally lacking track record in the market. This is because the market is still coming about. But this also means that financing risks are very high. So if it's possible to mitigate those risks, according to some estimates, project costs will down up to 50%. So there will be a real competitive advantage for each developer and investor. So in this sense, we talk about bankability, because bankability is the ability of a project to raise finance. So bankability is very important also as a practical angle, you know, to look into bottlenecks and enablers in financing a project and regulating the hydrogen economy, which is very different from the fossil fuel economy. So this means that bankability is entwined with law and policy, where we are still enacting relevant legislation for hydrogen. So to look into what financing entails, let's consider early stage, mid stage, and late stage of projects. So early stage, because of the lack of a track record, we really need integrity, but also creativity. So a crucial consideration involves establishing an acceptable risk profile for financing. This means allocating risks to entities that can bear such risks, that are best equipped to handle them. This includes not only financiers or governments, but also insurers, sponsors in general. So in this initial stage of the green hydrogen sector, public sector grants such as the H2 bank, concessionary funding are key for project financing to crowd in private investment. So the problem with European projects, and this was also mentioned before, is very common, and the fact that projects are too small. So it was mentioned that now we just have a lot of pilots, and this doesn't really harness economies of scale and doesn't really attract off-takers. So we need to achieve scale, financial viability, and bankability for these projects to rely on what? On blended finance. So how we can best scale up public funding by crowding in private funding. So beyond own funds and venture development, we need a long-term ramped up public funding. We know that through the IRA, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, producers receive a $3 credit for each kilogram of green hydrogen they supply for 10 years after eligible projects come online until 2050. So again, 2050, we don't have such a measure in Europe. This means a smart policy environment. Of course, things can change. We know the United States, but I will come back to the IRA and also other kinds of incentives, in particular in Italy. So at this stage, still the early stage, which is crucial, as for all startup projects, we need to ensure origination. As you know, the problem about especially supporting green hydrogen projects is origination, feasibility, and land, permitting, and access to water. I will come back to access to water, which is a bit the elephant in the room. When meeting with regulators, we realize the growing awareness about the situation of water access for hydrogen projects in Europe. Not really in Norway, as you know, but in Southern Europe. So beyond the permitting, I mentioned in legal terms at this stage, it's feasible and it's necessary, as the tariff incentives in Italy require, to also have non-binding MOUs in place. So memorandum of understanding with key stakeholders, preliminary agreements in general. And this is aligned with due diligence reports to validate the feasibility and risk assessment of the project. Then mid-stage, more consolidated finance is in place. This means anchoring the project to bankable H2 of takers through HPAs. We talk about PPAs, in the power sector, and HPAs in the hydrogen sector. So we also need to secure feedstocks, and this is done through supply agreements, and to engage with local stakeholders. This is very important. Local stakeholders, that means municipalities, of course, also to use industrial areas that are abandoned and can be dedicated to H2 production, which requires quite some land. Sorry. And then, of course, new equity investors. And this is still aligned with due diligence updates. So coming late stage, the project must be bankable now. And here we can apply traditional finance. So this means a pool of banks and investment banks, of course, private equity and bonds. So I would like to focus the importance of bonds and the fact that maybe we're not talking enough of the green bond regulation, which is the first regional green bond standard worldwide. So it still needs to be actually implemented, but it's a great incentive for sustainable finance vehicles to be chosen by banks and for banks to be incented to support private financing. So access to water, we saw it's an early stage risk. And according to a recent IRENA report from December, water scarcity poses a threat to over 45% hydrogen projects in Spain, Portugal, and Italy. And this is a situation that is quite significant, because a big portion of the planned projects is located in regions experiencing high water stress. So looking ahead to 2040, with the hydrogen production that is expected to surge by 243%. So this is, again, IRENA's numbers. The total water withdrawal and consumption in the sector soars over 400%. So this is why we promote, as Smart Energy, the use of wastewater and seawater for hydrogen production and cooling processes. But we also know that there are other prioritized use of wastewater and necessary permitting to be in place. So this is really a matter of balancing different interests. Our experience with the H2 bank. So Smart Energy sees any support given at the EU and member state level as very beneficial for developing green hydrogen projects, not other colors of hydrogen. As you know, the Commission was also be open to low level of carbons in hydrogen for the next rounds. We believe that the future is, of course, green. So we prefer a form of support in combination of CAPEX and OPEX, so capital investments and operating costs, but mainly OPEX, of course, because CAPEX can be also overly generous and not really implemented with the operation of the project. So in this sense, the H2 Bank really improves previous schemes, for example, from the Recovery and Resilience Facility, which gave financial support to hydrogen projects in the form of CAPEX only, so investments. This happened, for example, in Portugal and Spain. So CAPEX and OPEX is a much better idea. The economics of the H2 Bank. So in the initial round, we will see that the crucial factors for successfully bidding in the auction are the sector's willingness to pay and a substantial value. So a project will be big, the volume, and then the willingness to pay, because this means that sectors that have the highest willingness to pay, for example, refineries, the maritime sector, even the aviation sector, possibly the aviation sector, are poised to dominate the market, which is not the perfect scenario, but this is typical of a market-based mechanism, agnostic to supporting different sectors in different ways. But it's problematic because it will add public funding to sectors that have widely benefited from the windfall of oil and gas prices in these past years. So this is why a lot of lawyers and we believe that we need buckets, we need sectors, options that are reserved to different sectors, because the willingness to pay and contingencies of sectors are very different. And we need lighthouse projects. So, for example, focusing on hydrogen combustion in industries, that willingness, where the willingness to pay is usually lower because there are lower margins compared to refineries. So these other industries also should have the possibility and capacity to decarbonize and benefit from the learning curve. So there is, of course, a positive feedback from our perspective as a ground level developer and investor. And the positive feedback is that the H2 Bank is still a positive step in achieving 10 million tons of renewable hydrogen production in the EU by 2030. And possibly with an additional quota of 10 million tons for import. As you know, Norway is very active on exporting to Europe. So implementing this market-based measure, the auction, the H2 Bank, is crucial for the funding gap. But it should also be seen in light of the policy ecosystem. We mentioned the ETS, the gas and hydrogen markets package that was just passed, and the delegated acts on the RFN both. But of course, the negative feedback is about the scale, which is too low, considering that the pilot auction is now for 800 million, and the second round will be 2.2 billion worth. But the estimate is for a total investment required for production, transportation, and consumption of 10 million tons of renewable hydrogen, in between 335 and 471 billion euros. So it's not really possibly matching or even crowding in private finance. So this is not just a problem of scale, but also of scope. So at what level are we coordinating across governance levels? So for example, are hydrogen valleys coordinating with each other? Is there a strategy there? And we see the difference with the US, again, the Department of Energy's most recent Clean Hydrogen Hubs initiative. And this will, of course, need to be understood from an institutional level. So what level of coordination member states allow for and the Commission proposes. And then we can also see the difference of how we are talking about financing hydrogen projects vis-a-vis storage projects and wind projects. So there is some mismatch. When it comes from financing, when it comes to financing storage projects within the Investors Dialogue on Energy platform, which is a European Commission's initiative, we see a lot of dialogue for innovative finance. So especially to support the creation of a new fund to support storage projects, so renewable energy storage projects in Europe, because we know that we really need to scale up storage. And suggestions come from investors like us for a fund to fund projects or with the actual involvement of the EIB, the European Investment Bank, or a direct equity fund at national level. And also, when it comes to wind financing, we are aware of the European Investment Bank's dedicated package to counter guarantee, so enhancing finance access for the wind power sector. And we don't see such initiatives in the hydrogen sector, where targets are very high, very ambitious, luckily, but still means are quite limited. So we need new financing vehicles to finance H2 projects in line of what we've seen. So very quickly at the federal level, so coming from the region to the federal level in another continent, in the United States, the Inflation Reduction Act has really changed a lot in the financing landscape. We know that the Net Zero Industry Act in Europe and the H2 Bank came as a reaction to the IRA. And we know that the IRA is the most impactful climate regulatory framework thus far. So as you can see from the slide, the IRA has a structured approach with funds distributed by industry. So supporting the buckets approach that I was mentioning before, and hydrogen hubs again. I also mentioned support to hydrogen until 2050. And this is why now, for example, as you can see from the slide, announced plan to build a manufacturing facility in Michigan, or SED1 funding in Texas and Louisiana. So why is it so? I would like to focus on three aspects. So learning lessons for everyone. At least the first aspect is the institutional one again. With the IRA, the Department of Energy became the federal dynamo of decarbonization and revamped a loan program office. So really focused on financing and gathering banks, even at the local level, at the level of green banks, so public banks supporting just the green projects. So creating really an ecosystem to transform not just energy, but the entire productive economy and even finance. This is why we really need this kind of ecosystem in Europe, where we don't really have a culture for green banks, but we may support some different understanding of how banks evaluate projects, especially when it comes to green hydrogen projects, because traditional finance rules don't really apply. And so as a second point, we should learn from the IRA that the sectoral approach really works. And this is what we need for the next round of the H2 auction, the H2 Bank. And then third, we know that we cannot replicate the IRA in the European Union because we lack a fiscal union. We lack the Department of Energy, cannot be replicated, but we can leverage current policies. For example, the Net Zero Industry Act to enable partnerships through the Net Zero Industry Act platform. So industrial partnerships to cooperate also with third countries for a net zero value chain to support exports and imports of green H2, including from Norway. So Norway would definitely benefit from this platform. So the main point is, differently from the US, we over rely on state aid flexibilization. So, you know, the GBER, the TF. So all instruments whereby member states do industrial policy in line with their own financial capacity, and we should really avoid this. So considering the Italian level that I mentioned before, Italy has recently introduced a tariff scheme to support renewable hydrogen by electrolytic process and biohydrogen projects in Italy. And this is set forth in a decree now under public consultation. So the keys of the proposal are the openness, not the decision about, but still the openness to the bucket approach, so to a sectoral approach. And second, an incentive that is based on both CAPEX and OPEX for 2024-2027, so starting very soon, possibly also beyond 2027, which is really what we are supporting, since there are very few H2 projects that can come online this year and even next year in Italy. The quotas are very generous and ambitious, 250,000 tons per year of electrolytic H2 and 50,000 tons per year of biohydrogen projects. And the main instruments that financial support comes through a contract for difference, two-way. So as you know, it's a mechanism to incentivize investment in energy production assets with a very high capex upfront cost that is too high for the current market. And CFD provides a stable price, stable prices over a long period, taking away the possibility of capital gain that is overly high, because there is some capitalization from actors. So you know the different levels of floating reference market prices and fixed strike prices, and the fact that if the strike price is above the reference market price, the state pays the difference to the developer. If the strike price is below the reference market price, the renewable producer pays the difference. So this is the two-way. So we really support this understanding of market-based, but still public-funded mechanism. And in addition to the H2 bank, what really differentiates these tariffs and why you understand the reasoning for Italy not to follow the auctions as a service approach is that the Italian tariff allows for inflation-based adjustments, whereas the H2 bank does not do that. So another important part of this is that it happens in auctions for wind installations, for example, wind capacity in the UK, that auctions were not adjusted to inflation, and they were just a failure because no one really bid. So we want to avoid that from a regulatory perspective. And as developers, we really welcome this, considering the levels of inflation. So it's not really paradise on earth in the sense that we will put forward some adjustments. For example, as I mentioned, the fact that the incentives can start from next year. There is really no project this year and should be longer than 10 years. Considering also incentives from a comparative perspective, so in the US, for example. So just rounding up so that we have some time for the questions. I have a couple of slides more on the ecosystem. So how can we really make Europe attractive for green hydrogen? I think that we have a great intangible asset, which is regulation, which is more ambitious than in the US. So maybe we don't have the fast track of tax production credits, tax deduction, investment credits, but still we can support private funding, considering also the support for green hydrogen through the Net Zero Industry Act, we cannot really change the H2 bank setup as it is now, but we can include the sectoral approach. And we need to support also the possibility for member states to have national tariffs, as Italy has done. Another possibility is for the national level to implement tax deductions American style at the national level, by using also the sovereignty fund, the EU sovereignty fund, to create a level playing field so that we avoid overuse in state aid law, and we avoid some big players like Germany, even Italy, to use their national funds to support green hydrogen projects within their jurisdiction. So in a way, the sovereignty fund was created to become the big equalizer in public funding for Europe. But still, it has not been used for being the big equalizer for green hydrogen projects. So another and last point is that we need to understand the different policies that we mentioned in light of the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the CBAM, and the ETS, some mechanisms that we mentioned before. As you know, the EU ETS, the free allowances will be given to green H2 projects. So there will be a phase-in of free allowances, which is great news. But the EU will phase out the ETS while the CBAM will be phased in. So it's really important in this conjuncture to remark that we need green H2. So this is supported also by the new phasing of free allowances in the EU ETS system. But the Commission needs to be consistent there. So it needs to consider only H2, green H2 for the H2 bank. So not really opening the door for low carbon hydrogen. And yes, hydrogen and derivatives imports to the EU will have to take into account EU and ETS, the EU ETS and the CBAM mechanism, so that it will really be applicable to export to Europe, and both import and export, exports to Europe and imports in Europe will be decisive. So this is it. I will be very happy to answer to your questions.
Good. Okay, thank you very much, Esmeralda. Again, excellent presentation with a comparative perspective on funding mechanism, and also your discussion about how it could be improved and the new models of financing. So you added a lot to both experiences and possible ways forward, and a lot of things that we could pick up and do further research on at the HyValue Center. So then, Ignacio, have you picked up any questions in the chat? Or so please go along with the Q&A.
Yes, Esmeralda, grazie mille. Thank you for a great presentation. Small world, fantastic to have you here. Esmeralda and I used to be work colleagues. Now she is doing super interesting stuff, combining academia and practice. So it has been great to have you here for this. We have a couple questions, and I apologize to Gunnar for not having seen this before, because I thought I was going to get notified. He had some questions for Sigmund and Johanna, but I do packing up for one from Gunnar to you, Esmeralda, about the ETS. So ETS is wondering, and Gunnar is wondering about if you could clarify on what's being phased out. I guess what you mean is the phase out of the grandfathering, the free quotas are not being given anymore. And I was also thinking about the importance of legislation to push for hydrogen. But you want to reply to Gunnar really quickly to clarify this? And then if anybody has more questions, please write them down. I have a couple as well to give a little bit of time for people to think about it, so we can have a conversation with Esmeralda on this. Yes, Esmeralda?
Yes, thank you for the great question. So, yes, the CBAM was presented in the Fit for 55 reforms, and in a way, the reform is, as you mentioned, to phase out the free allowances. So, in this sense, the phase-in plan for CBAM is to price imported goods based on embedded emissions. So it's more about our external commercial policy. So this means that importers in the sectors covered by CBAM, cement, aluminum, fertilizers, hydrogen as well, actually, iron and steel, will be required to surrender certificates equivalent to the emissions that are included in embedded in their products. This is a phase-in, seizing the free allocation of EU ETS allowances, and it's actually over a 9-year period for sectors covered by CBAM. So it's going to be from 2026 to 2034. So it's a phase out of free allocation, beginning slowly and then accelerating to the end of the period. So in the transition period, the CBAM will apply to the proportion of emissions that are not covered by the EU ETS. So at the free allocation under the EU ETS.
Yeah, thank you so much for that clarification on an important point, Esmeralda. I will take a question for me, but members of the audience, please send if you have any questions for Esmeralda as well. And Esmeralda, you said something that really made me think and react. You mentioned that what you see ahead is that we have a market for hydrogen and ammonia that, in a way, will have buyers that need to decrease the CO2 emissions, and those buyers are going to be the large players that are the large contaminants. And you mentioned, for example, refineries, producers of oil and gas, hydrocarbons, plastic manufacturers, and so on and so forth. And then you said that this was problematic because they are the ones that, in a way, will also be the ones attracting more public funding for their projects. Could you explain or expand? I think you don't have to explain this, but could you expand this a little bit and then maybe mention what could be an alternative for this? Should we maybe at some point start thinking about kind of like deducting you points based on the kind of activities that you have? Or should we let the market work, and those that are more willing to pay for something will be also perhaps more willing to invest more in obtaining public funding? Because I see the conundrum. The ones that are contaminating the more are the ones that are going to receive the public funding because they're the large players, and then they're going to continue having more advantages in the future, whereas innovative businesses might struggle a little bit on this. But if you could expand on this, that would be great.
Yes. So the H2 auction works as based on the willingness to pay and H2 demand. Usually projections are by 2030. So we see that the highest willingness to pay, so willingness to really be off-takers and agree to the auction ceiling price and the price that will come out of the auction, is for very big sectors, those that I mentioned that have been, in the case of refineries that have been profiting from the geopolitical conjunction. So in this sense, the refineries, but also shipping, aviation, possibly. Whilst we see that the chemical and steel sectors cannot really afford, do not really have the willingness to pay for this type of energy, through hydrogen, green hydrogen. And then we see that the willingness to pay goes down when it comes to really industrial sectors, such as the ceramic sector, the cement sector as well, that should also be among the first to decarbonize because of how they are facing the market so far and the prioritization that they may have, because we need cement, we need ceramics. We saw how they've been hardly hit by the electricity price crisis. So in this sense, it's really a market mechanism that is not mitigated so far in the H2 bank auction, which is agnostic, right? There is no choice for any differentiation among sectors. So your question is very proper because you're asking for mitigation or even design factors that can be implemented even in the H2 bank auctions or in all other tariffs and auctions that states want to implement domestically. And I believe that the bucket sectoral approach should be chosen, understanding the quotas, different quotas for each sector. So there should be a big type of homework done by the national authorities, understanding where decarbonization should happen first and which sectors should be prioritized there. And then different rules for different sectors so that the refinery sector doesn't really take it all, because now the approach is everyone competes with everyone, but actually everyone is quite different across sectors.
Yes, thank you so much, Esmeralda. I don't see that we have any further questions in the chat. That doesn't mean that what you have not said is very interesting. I think we are all thinking about it and reflecting on it. But I'll allow myself, Peruve, if you let me, one naughty questions for Esmeralda. I'm known among those of you that know me for not asking very political questions. But Esmeralda, if I am a European company and I want to do business on hydrogen, should I put my investment in the US or in Europe?
This is a very good question, and I like it's now politically correct. So we are investing in Europe, and we decided to focus on Europe because of the different levels of regulations. So not just the EU level, which gives some stability and coordination, some coordination, not all possible coordination, but also the national level. Still, I perfectly understand the position of NEL or Ørsted. If there is the possibility to differentiate across markets and to promptly start with an office and a business development team in the United States, why not doing that? You know, if there is that kind of heavy weight of an industrial player. So I think that the big industrial players are doing that. Iberdrola did that. So Europe should be quite wary of regulatory shopping, forum shopping as well, in the sense that some players will stay in Europe but put a lot of money in the US. And we saw even Equinor did that with wind farms, offshore wind farms. So hydrogen will just follow because of how the market works and how hydrogen projects are not supported by traditional financial rules.
Wonderful. Then that means that my business strategy of diversifying where I put the little academic income that I get on different markets might be not too bad. Thank you so much, Esmeralda.
Right.
This has been really nice hearing your perspectives and also the ideas that are coming from the private sector and also from a different jurisdiction, because you also spoke about the Italian market, and which is different from the Norwegian one. And I just take away this idea of access to water being a problem, something that we don't even think about here, but it's going to be a massive issue for Southern Mediterranean Europe. And I'll give the word now to Peruve, so Peruve can wrap up this webinar.
Yes, thank you again, Esmeralda, for the further conversation, and to Ignacio for leading this session. I'm sure that many of you still have questions, and I think this event brought up a lot of questions, and that is the idea about that we learn a lot, and I certainly learned a lot and I've started to formulate new questions that we could address in research within the center. So thanks a lot for that. You have delivered excellent presentations and the responses to the questions. So finally, I will just thank very much to all of you attending the webinar, and those of you that raised important questions to the speakers. So by this, I think we just end the session and have a nice evening.